Hello, English 2 students. This is a glossary of literary devices that we will use throughout the semester. It's important that as we go through these that you also listen very carefully to some of the commentary that I make, because when we have unit tests, I often include a few questions based on comments I make during the videos. I just want to make sure that you are actually watching the videos and paying attention to the commentary that I make about them. So most of these literary devices will be very familiar to you, but some of them may be new. It's important when you're talking about what you're reading to use what I like to call the language of literature. Just like any field or subject area has its own terminology, the study of literature does as well. So, for example, if I were to take my car to an auto mechanic and try to explain what's going on with it, what's wrong with it, if I lacked the language of auto mechanics, it would make it really difficult for me to speak to the mechanic in an intelligent way. Same thing when you're studying literature. If you want to be able to talk about something in an intelligent way, you need to know the terminology to use. So let's dig right in. First word here is character, super easy word to start with. So character is just an imagined person in a literary work. I put some of my favorite characters on this slide for you to view. The next character-themed word here is protagonist, and the protagonist is the central character in the story who engages our interest or sympathy. So it's the main character, the one that we are supposed to follow, care about, the one that has the conflicts and the problems that engage our interest. The protagonist does not have to be a nice person. Thus, I've included a picture of Frankenstein's monster here. It just has to be the main character whose story we are following. So the main character could be, a villain, but if they are the person or the character that we're supposed to be following, then they are the protagonist. The antagonist is the character or force that opposes the protagonist. Now, this can take the form of a literal character, a person, or an animal, if it's a children's book, or if the main characters are animals, can be that force against the protagonist. But the antagonist doesn't have to be a person. It can be just a force. So the antagonist could be something in the protagonist's own mind that they're fighting against. It could be a natural force or a technological force that they're fighting against. It does not have to be a person. Okay, flat characters are one-dimensional figures, just one-sided. They have simple personalities. They don't show any depth or complexity. They don't have the potential to change or grow in any way. And often they are just kind of background characters. And definitely you would not want your protagonist to be a flat character, because then we couldn't relate to that main character. A round character, conversely, is a character that is complex, multidimensional. That means there's many sides to the character's personality, and they mirror real people. They seem like real people. And this goes even if you're talking about a non-human main character or a non-human round character, like an alien or an animal. It still has to capture something of that human quality to be believable. So some characters I put on here, Frodo from The Lord of the Rings is a complex character. He has many sides to his personality. He's got internal and external struggles. He grows as a person over the course of his journey. Romeo and Juliet, complex people with complex problems. And then I also included Greg Heffley here from The Diary of the Wimpy Kid. A lot of you read those books when you were younger, and he is an example of a round character because he embodies, lots of different personality quirks and emotions, and he really mirrors what it's like to be a real person in the real world. Okay, the next character term is static character. And a static character is a character whose beliefs, outlook, or values don't change over the course of the story. They begin believing one thing and they end the story believing the same thing. They don't change. And a lot of times, static characters are your villains, but they don't have to be. I included 3 sets of villains here from Disney to give you examples of, this Wicked Stepsisters, Gaston, Scar. They were bad from the beginning and they were bad at the end. They didn't grow, they didn't learn their lessons. Dynamic characters on the opposite end are characters who do grow. Their beliefs change, their values change, their attitudes change as the story progresses. For example, the Beast, he experiences both a physical change and a emotional change. Think about Nemo's dad. Nemo's dad begins the movie very scared and overprotective, and by the end of the movie, he's able to let Nemo go and join the other fish at school. Aladdin is also a character that changes and matures over the course of the story. So those are dynamic characters, and they engage our interest and are typically protagonists or main characters in the story. Okay, stereotypes are stock characters. They can be called either one. These are characters who don't have any attributes except of their class or profession. We're supposed to take a look at them and make certain assumptions about them. For example, we have the bully jock character here, the grumpy old man, the ignorant hillbilly, and the emo kid. We're supposed to draw some conclusions based on the physical attributes of these characters. In real life, we don't want to do that. We don't want to look at somebody and just say they are a certain way because they look a certain way. But in literature, writers will give you clues to characters' personalities, or at least the identities the characters want to take on. They're trying to be a stereotype. So be aware that there are stereotypes in literature. You don't really want your main characters to be stereotypes because you want them to seem like real people with real problems that the reader will care about. Another character word is foil. Now, this may be a new word to you. A foil is a character who sets off by contrast character traits of the protagonist. So, because the two are so opposite, they highlight the differences. So, for example, Lightning McQueen and Mater, they're very different. And the bigger those differences, the more their qualities come out. So the more clumsy and awkward and beat up Mater looks, the more smooth, cool Lightning McQueen looks. So they play off each other. If you've seen any of the Harry Potter movies or read the books, Draco and Harry are foils. Harry is courageous, selfless, a good friend. He's loyal. Draco is none of those things. Draco is selfish and cowardly. So the more cowardly Draco is, the more brave Harry looks, and vice versa. And the last little picture here is from the show Animaniacs. And I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's kind of an old show, but it was one of my favorites as a kid. This is Pinky and the Brain. So a common stereotype that you'll see in literature and on TV and the movies is the idea of the little smart wise guy and the big dumb goofy guy that he gets to do all of his dirty work. So that's just another example of foils. Okay, a confidant is a character who gives the protagonist a chance to speak his thoughts. And the confidant's role there is to allow us sometimes to see into the head of a character or a main character that we otherwise would not be able to see into. In the Harry Potter films especially, Harry talks with Ron and Hermione about what he's feeling and thinking. If he didn't do that, then we would not know how he was feeling. And so the purpose of the confidant is really so the reader can learn more about what the main character is thinking inside. Frog and Toad, two of my favorite characters from my childhood, best friends. They're confidants for each other. We learn what they're thinking and feeling because of the things that they say to each other. Another character word that you might not be familiar with is the anti-hero. The anti-hero is a main character, but they are unable to take their own lives into their hands. They're just surviving. They don't have a glorious existence. They're kind of a loser, but yet they still engage our interest and our sympathy and can be very strong characters. So Jack Sparrow from Pirates of the Caribbean movies, he's an example of an anti-hero. He has, lots of personality quirks and things rarely go his way, but we still care about his story. Greg Heffley, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, same thing. And then Neville Longbottom, if you're familiar with Harry Potter, he was awkward, kind of goofy looking. I mean, his last name's Longbottom. And we're not supposed to really take Neville seriously at first, but then if you watch the movies, you understand that Neville plays a very important role at the very end in defeating Voldemort. Characterization is the process by which an author reveals a character's personality. So characterization can be either direct, so things that the author simply states about the character. For example, he was a grumpy old man. We don't have to do any digging to understand that. The author just tells us what the character's like. Indirect, on the other hand, this is when the author provides clues to the character's personality through a variety of ways. So the author can use dialogue, what the character says, how they say it, what other characters say about this character, description, how the character dresses, carries themselves, and then actions, the things that the character does, can also reveal a lot about the character's personality. In more complex stories, you're going to get more clues than you are going to get direct statements about the character. And that allows you as a reader to think more deeply about these characters. And it's just more fun to pick up on some of these clues on your own than to just have it flat out told to you. All characters need motivation, especially your main characters. So motivation is that external or internal force that compels a character to act as he or she does in a story. If there's no motivation, if we can't understand why a character is taking an action that he or she is, then we don't care about it. And we ask, what's the point in that? It doesn't seem to mirror real life, because in real life, we do things out of motivation. Now, there are a lot of things that can motivate a character. Love, the search for love, security, money, material things, a sense of belonging. Those are all things that a character can be motivated by. In my opinion, the number one thing that all people are motivated by is happiness. And that can take on a different look depending on who the person is. So for some people, they feel like they have to have love in order to be happy, or they feel like they have to have success in order to be happy, or money, or they have to fit in, or they won't be happy. So deep down, all of these characters are looking for peace, happiness, but they, for whatever reason, think they're going to find it in different ways. So just be aware of that, thinking about, as we read, what do our characters want? What do they think is going to make them happy? All right, moving on from characters, we'll talk about setting really briefly. So setting is the time and place in which the story takes place. And the setting can have a very large impact on the action of the story and on the characters themselves. For example, if you have a story that's set, let's say it's set in the 1800s, well, your characters need to act and behave like they are in the 1800s, or else it's not realistic. And so the culture of the time, the values and beliefs of the time are going to impact the way the characters behave. So that's why it's important when you're reading a story to try to figure out approximately when the story is taking place, because sometimes the author doesn't just come out and tell you it was 1956 or whatever. You have to take those clues, because that can explain a lot about why a character acts the way that they do. Because today, we might not understand why someone from 1956 would act in a certain way, because we wouldn't act that way today. Values and beliefs change over time. But it is important to think about, how does the setting impact the action? How does it impact what the characters say and do? Atmosphere is created through the setting and through description. The atmosphere is the mood of the story. So this is how the author wants you as a reader to feel while you're reading. If they want an eerie mood, like this picture over here, They would describe the setting in such a way. If they want it to be a calm, peaceful mood, same thing. So atmosphere relies heavily on the author's word choice. So the words that the author chooses to use can create a certain mood and can make you as a reader feel a certain way that they want you to feel. All right, we're going to move on and talk about plot now. So the most important word to know when it comes to plot is conflict. Conflict is the problem or tension that must be addressed in the story. Um, and it has to come to some sort of resolution, if not perfect resolution. It has to come to some sort of end by the end of the story. Without a conflict, the story is pointless. And I'm sure there are times when somebody has walked up to you and started telling you what you thought was going to be a great story, and you could never figure out what exactly the problem was or why they were telling you the story. You lose interest very quickly. Problems that we hear about, on the other hand, capture our interest. Drama captures our interest. And sometimes, we don't necessarily want drama in our own lives, but we definitely like to read about drama. We like to watch TV shows that have drama. Problems are interesting, and they are what drives the story. There are two main types of conflict: external and internal. External conflicts are when the character's struggling with something outside of himself or herself. So it could be a struggle with another character. It could be a struggle against nature. It could be a struggle against their own destiny. You see that a lot in Greek myths. Um, the character can't outrun his fate. Characters often struggle with technology as well. Think of all the stories of technology moving beyond our ability to control it and taking over. Society can also cause problems for characters. They may be outcasts from society, and society may work against them. Internal conflicts, on the other hand, are when the character has some problem inside themselves. So perhaps they are struggling to make a decision, or they're struggling to do the right thing. They're tempted to do the wrong thing. Thus, we get this common stereotype here of the good angel and the devil on the shoulder. The character has to choose. But this is that's an external way of expressing an internal problem that character is having. It could be that the character has a mental illness or has lost perception of reality, and that is a struggle that they're having. Maybe they've lost self-confidence. And then other temptations, the temptation for wealth or success, such as you see with this picture here from the Lord of the Rings. This is where Frodo first, accidentally ends up with the ring on his finger, and that begins a long journey of temptation for him to keep the ring for himself when he knows that he shouldn't. The plot is just the sequence of events in a story, and I'm sure you're familiar with Freytag's pyramid here. You've probably seen it in every English class that you've had. Gives the basic plot line of any fiction story. Now, stories don't have to follow this plot line, and in my creative writing class, I like to do activities where we play around with plot, but this is, 90% of the time you're going to see the plot play out in this way. The first section of the plot is the exposition, and this is the part of the plot where the character's background and the setting are established. So, first picture here, there was an old woman who lived in a shoe. Little nursery rhyme, that's all we need to know. That's all the exposition that we need to know. She lives in a shoe. I do need to add that she has a lot of children. So we have the basic who, what, there. Harry Potter, same thing. At the beginning of The Sorcerer's Stone, movie or book, we learn about Harry's life before he learns that he's a wizard. He lives at Privet Drive with his terrible aunt and uncle who mistreat him. His bedroom is, under the stairs, this little tiny hole that he has to live in. And then we get this Hagrid coming to take him away from that, but we've established the basics of Harry's life before he learns that he's a wizard. So the exposition gives us all that who, what, when, and where that we need to understand the story from that point. And it can be difficult when a story doesn't provide a lot of exposition because we have to look for clues later in the story to figure out who, what, when, where these people are. The rising action begins when we figure out what the conflict is. And once that conflict's introduced, events are set in motion from that point on, and that's the rising action. So I've got some examples here. If you've ever seen the movie Goonies, the boys. The problem is that one of the boys is going to lose his home, and he's got to find some money. And they find this treasure map, and then they go and they're going to look. So this is kind of what I would call, the term is inciting incident. It's the thing that happens that sets off the rising action. It sets off the main part of the plot. When Hagrid tells Harry he's a wizard, then we have a conflict because Harry's life, yeah, he had problems, but it was going along. It was the status quo. It was the way things always were. Learns he's a wizard. Bam, everything's different. Now he's got a problem because he's got to learn how to be a wizard in the world and all of that and what that means. And then it leads to even more and more complications as he learns that he has to defeat Voldemort. Romeo and Juliet, rising action begins the moment that the two set eyes on each other, that love at first sight moment. Bam, we got a problem because they're from two opposing families. So all of that information in the prologue in Romeo and Juliet is just letting us know who these people are, and we don't get to the conflict until Romeo and Juliet actually see each other. Okay, another word that it goes along with the plot is something called in media res. And this is a Latin term that means in the midst of things. Sometimes we have a story that doesn't give us a lot of exposition. We start right with the rising action, right in the middle of the ongoing rising action. Think about, if you've ever seen Star Wars movies, how besides the little scrolling that they give you at the beginning, right after that, bam, you're right into the action. And they don't necessarily go back and give a lot of exposition. They expect you to have watched the previous movies. Stories also can do this. They can start right in the middle of the action. Last year, some of you read The Odyssey, and the Odyssey begins as Odysseus is on his way back from war. And it doesn't give us all of that background. It just starts right with the adventures that he's having as he's trying to make it home. The Telltale Heart is another example of a story that does not tell us the who, what, when, where, and why at the very beginning in that exposition. We have these two characters, and we have to figure out on our own what their relationship is, what their background is. And Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote the story, never actually really comes out and tells us what the issue is between them or what their history is. We just have to use our imaginations, which can be kind of fun. Okay, complications are new conflicts that interfere with the protagonist's ability to resolve the story's main conflict. So whenever you have a problem, usually you're not able to solve it right away. And if we're reading a story, if the character can just immediately solve his or her problem, the story's not going to engage our interest, and it's not going to seem very true to life, because in life, as things come up, they can be complicated by other problems. So expect to see complications as the story progresses before the character's able to actually solve the main conflict of the story. Okay, the climax is the point or the moment of greatest tension in the story at which the outcome is to be decided. So throughout the rising action, the character is trying to solve whatever the conflict is, and it gets to kind of a breaking point where there's basically a do or die moment. And it doesn't necessarily mean do or die, like in these two examples. Obviously, it does mean do or die, but in other stories, it may just be a very critical or suspenseful point. And you can recognize the climax of a story because it's the point at which the protagonist makes a decision or takes an action that determines how the story will end. Up until the climax, the story could end in multiple ways. But at that climactic moment, the decision that's made and the outcome of that decision, the story can then only end in one way, and so it determines how the story will end. Will Romeo and Juliet both wake up in the tomb, or will Juliet wake up in the tomb and they can be reunited, or is the climactic action going to end with both of their deaths? In the movie The Lion King, Simba makes the decision to come back to the Pride Lands, and um, that point where he fights Scar, that's a do or die moment. That's the moment of highest tension. However, that fight plays out, that's going to determine how the story will end. Okay, an epiphany. This is the moment of insight, discovery, or revelation where that main character changes somehow, and it's an internal change. It's an aha moment, like they figure something important out. And so the epiphany often happens just before the climax, and it leads to the climax. The new um, outlook or belief or value that the character now espouses leads the main character to make that climactic decision. So the epiphany, if you're ever asked, what epiphany does a character have, look for those moments that occur right before the climax of the story, before the most suspenseful part, because that's where the character is going to have a realization that they need to change directions, they need to change paths and do something about their situation. Immediately after the climax is the falling action. And the falling action can be very, very short. Sometimes you don't even have falling action. But the falling action, it explores what happens immediately after the climactic decision is made. How that climax plays out. It gives us the aftermath. In the Harry Potter movies, the aftermath, of the battle for Hogwarts, the climactic moment of that series, we see the destruction, we see the fallout and the aftermath of that great battle. So that would consider that the falling action. It answers the question, so this is what this looks like after the climactic decision. Then at the very end of the story, you have the resolution. And the resolution is when the loose ends are tied up and the story comes to a satisfying conclusion. And when I say satisfying, I don't mean necessarily personally satisfying. It's just at a point where we know this particular story is over. And sometimes that's a happy moment, but sometimes things are resolved in a unhappy way, such as in a tragedy. We know the story's over and we're sad about how it all ended, but we know it's over. So resolution, most of the time it's going to be a happy thing. But in some stories, there's not a happy resolution. It ends sadly, but it ends and we know it's over. Okay, to move on to a few kind of miscellaneous plot terms. Flashbacks are when the main character, or any characters, I guess, think back or relive, events that happened before the opening of the story. You'll see this a lot in stories that start in media res. Stories that start with the rising action often rely on flashbacks for us to understand who the characters are. So, for example, the movie Up begins kind of right in the action, but we have this main character who, when the movie opens, he's already a grumpy old man. We're already into the action, but we get these flashbacks of him during happier days with his wife, and that helps us understand his motivation, why he behaves the way that he does, why he's so unhappy. But we get that through flashbacks. We don't get it through exposition at the very beginning of the movie. The same thing with Cinderella. We have this flashback of her with her father during happier times before he married the wicked stepmother. And these flashbacks help us help us understand the character at the point the story opens, helps us understand them better and why they act the way they do or believe things that they do. Foreshadowing instead gives hints to things that are going to happen later in the story, to little hints to big moments that are going to happen later, and you have to kind of watch out for them. But sometimes when it comes to foreshadowing, you can kind of think, well, maybe that might be important. Maybe I should remember that detail. But often with foreshadowing, we don't realize the clues we've been given until later when the big moment takes place. Then we can look back and say, oh, those were all clues. So I put a couple examples here from Harry Potter. We've got Madame Pomfrey and the Mandrake. She's the herbology teacher, and she's teaching them how to plant mandrakes. And the mandrake is used in magic to cancel or reverse transfiguration curses. So people who have been cursed to look a different way or turn into an animal or take on a different form. Later in that particular movie or book, we see some of the characters get transfigured. And so we didn't realize that when they were doing the herbology class earlier in the movie, but we figured out later that, oh, that's why Madame Pomfrey, that's why J.K. Rowling, the writer, put that in there, because later it was going to be useful. The same thing in the Prisoner of Azkaban movie. Hermione has this pendant here, the time turner, and she's able to stop time because she wants to go be able to take two classes that happen at the same time. She is really smart. She loves learning. So she wants to take two classes at one time. So in order to do that, she has to play around with time. Later on in the movie, we're able to look back and see all these kind of weird, quirky things that happen were because Hermione was messing with time, but we don't figure that out until the very end. Suspense is another plot-related word. Suspense is that pleasurable anxiety we feel that makes us want to know what's going to happen next. It keeps us turning the pages. And there are writers who are solely devoted to suspense, to putting us on edge, what's going to happen. And even though a lot of times we know things are going to happen, turn out well for the character, we still have that anxiety. We feel that anxiety that they are feeling. And it makes the story very interesting. Personally, I love suspense. It's one of my favorite genres to read. All right, moving on from plot, let's talk a little bit about the person or the speaker that's telling the story. Now, all stories have a point of view, and a point of view just refers to who is telling the story and how it's told. So this comic here, we've got two men, and in the first block here, we see the situation from the point of view of the man on the island. He's so excited to see a boat, he thinks he's going to be rescued. Then the comic flips that on its head, and we see from the perspective of the man in the boat. He's telling the story now, and he's got a different story to tell because he's so excited to see land. He's been floating around. So neither of them have been rescued, but both of them, we see the story from their different perspectives, from their different points of view. And depending on who's telling the story, we're going to get a different story. So if you've ever been asked in class to write from the perspective of a different character, it changes the story because different characters see things different ways. So the narrator is just the voice that's telling the story. And you never want to assume that the narrator is the author. Most of the time, it's not the author. The author will create this invented speaker to tell us the story. Sometimes the speaker is in the story, and sometimes the speaker is outside of the story looking in and telling us what's going on. So the first person point of view, first person narrator, is inside the story. They are a character. They are taking part in the action. They use pronouns I, me, us, we. We know that they're participating in the story, and they're telling us what's going on as it's happening to them or as it happened to them. Huck Finn is a very famous first-person narrator, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The Telltale Heart, that Edgar Allan Poe story that I was telling you about earlier, that's a very famous first-person narrator. And you have to be careful because first-person narrators could be unreliable. We're only getting their perspective, and they might not have a good grasp on reality. But the first-person narrator does not have to be the main character. The first-person narrator could be a secondary character. That's what we see in the novel The Great Gatsby, which you guys will read next year. The story is told by Nick, not Gatsby, but it is Gatsby's story that we hear. Second person point of view is just when the writer speaks directly to us, the reader, and they address us as you. So they're talking directly to us. You see this a lot in self-help books. I put a couple examples here of here's a novel and a short story that use that second person point of view and speak directly to us, but it's not very common in fiction because it's kind of awkward to put the reader into the story that way. Third person point of view, this is when the person telling us the story, the speaker telling us the story, is not in the story at all. They are outside of the story and they're just telling us what they see and hear. This narrator will use he, she, them, they. It will never use I or me because they are not in the story themselves. Now, sometimes this third person narrator can see into the heads of all the characters, and we call this third person omniscient. So can see into the thoughts and emotions. They know what each character's thinking. They're all powerful, all knowing, can look into the minds of each character. Many times, however, the third person narrator is limited. So the narrator can see into one character's head or maybe a few of the characters, but the narrator cannot see into every single character's head. Sometimes some characters we only get what they say and do, and we don't ever know what they're thinking, and we have to draw our own conclusions. So that's a third person limited narrator. A third person objective narrator is one that doesn't give us any thoughts or feelings. They simply state what they see. It's kind of like being a fly on the wall, just seeing, hearing, repeating back to us what they're seeing and hearing. You see this more in like newspaper articles when they're reporting the news. It's just what was seen, what was heard, what happened, but we don't get, it's impossible for a news writer to look into the heads of the people involved in the story. They have to go by what's said and done instead. There are a few stories that use this objective where we just get what happens. Hills Like White Elephants is an example. It's an Ernest Hemingway story where this man and woman are talking and they've got a big problem, but we never see into their heads. We have to use a lot of clues to figure out what their conversation is about, because the narrator never attempts to get into their minds. The tone of a story is the narrator's attitude towards the subject. In nonfiction, it's the author's attitude. But tone, we pick up on tone by the way that the narrator speaks, the words that the narrator uses. And we'll talk a lot more about tone later in the semester. Tone can be positive, neutral, or negative. For example, your narrator could present a delighted tone. By the words the narrator's using, you can tell that they really like their subject. They can use a straightforward and just give us kind of the facts. Or they might be disgusted. That would be a negative tone, disgusted by what they're trying to tell us. And we can tell they're disgusted by the words that they're using. So tone relies on word choice, and that's really important to remember. Irony is when there's a difference between what we perceive and what is revealed later on the story. So language and situations that seem opposite of what we would normally expect. For example, this little dog here named Lucky, we would expect that Lucky would live a charmed life. We would not expect a dog named Lucky to be lost. So reality, perception and reality are different. Dramatic irony is when we know something, but the characters don't know it. So in The Lion King, we know that Scar has killed Mufasa, but Simba does not know that. And it affects the way that he, the decisions that he makes from that point on. He has less information than we do. And we want to tell him that information, but we can't. And so we kind of struggle internally ourselves as we're viewing the movie or as we're reading stories like this, because we know the character is operating on false or faulty or partial information. Another example here is Sleeping Beauty, Aurora meeting Prince Philip. Neither of them know who each other are, but we know who they are. And their innocence, when it comes to that, causes some problems as the story goes on. Dramatic irony has two purposes, and I want you to pay attention to this. One purpose is to create humor. Sometimes we laugh because we see a character operating on faulty information. We know all the facts, but they don't. And so it's funny when they are acting on bad information. It also can create suspense because we know someone's out to get them, or we know there's a problem that they're unaware of, and that causes us anxiety, and we want to see things work out. So, comedy and suspense are two effects of dramatic irony. Situational irony is when everyone's surprised. The reader's surprised and the characters are surprised. So we actually need to take the gift of the Magi off of that. That belongs on dramatic irony. Um, what we would expect to happen in the real world um, does not happen. Something else happens. So in a normal world, we would not expect a fitness center to have an escalator out front. We would think that they want to encourage people to take the stairs. So in the normal world, that's how we would expect it to play out. Situational irony occurs when something happens that it's outside of our normal expectations. Verbal irony is when there's a difference between what a character says and what that character means by it. So the first example here from Romeo and Juliet, the prologue, the speaker in the prologue comes out and he gives us the background on the Montagues and the Capulets, and he says, two households both alike in dignity in fair Verona where we lay our scene. Well, he's being ironic here because we know, and he knows, that neither of these families have much dignity. They are involved in, constant fighting with each other. They don't act in a dignified way. So he's being ironic there. Understatement is a type of verbal irony that people use a lot, and I know that you have seen many and heard many examples in your own lives. One example of understatement in literature is when this character named Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye, he says, I have to have this operation. It isn't very serious. I have this tiny little tumor on the brain. Well, it's ironic because we know that a brain tumor is a very serious problem. It's a serious operation that he's going to have, but he understates it, and we know that he's really actually emphasizing that it is serious by pretending to de-emphasize it. Okay, a symbol is a person, object, action, or situation in a story that's used to represent something else. And many times that object or person or action represents an abstract thing, like something that we can't touch or see. It represents a feeling similar to how the flag, the American flag represents freedom. Freedom's an abstract thing. We can't touch it or feel it. So we take this concrete thing that we can see and we use it to express something that we can't see. And the same thing in literature. So this first picture I have here is of a river. It's Huck Finn and Jim on the river from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And they literally are on this river. So it's a physical thing. But the river represents something non-physical. And that is the idea of a journey. Huck Finn's on a journey. He's going to learn more about himself. He's going to learn about his values. So that river represents a journey. You see that a lot in literature. Other stories you might read about a storm approaching, and usually that storm approaching symbolizes that problems are coming. It foreshadows problems are coming for the main character. So those are two common symbols that are found in literature, but really anything can be a symbol as long as it represents something beyond itself. All right, an allusion. Allusion is a reference to something outside of the story itself. Now, pay attention that this is allusion with an A, not illusion. So an allusion is when the narrator or perhaps a character mentions something that's not a part of the story itself. They could mention a historical event, or they could mention a song, or they could mention a Greek myth or a story from the Bible. They could mention something from pop culture or our culture today that we're supposed to just understand. The problem occurs when a narrator or a character mentions something, but we don't recognize it because we're not familiar with it. If we miss that allusion, then we miss the author's point or the speaker's point. Because allusions are brief. The narrator will not go back and explain what the illusion means or where it comes from. They just expect you to know. This is why stories written, in decades past, if they reference historical things, we may not know what they are, and we may have to do a little research to understand what the point is. We won't know what the point is. So illusions can cause problems for readers. All right, our very last word, thank you for sticking with this video. Our very last word is theme, and theme is the central message or idea that the story is communicating. And the theme should always be in the form of a statement. So a statement about life. It doesn't mean it's a moral or a lesson that we're supposed to learn so we become better people. It could just be a message about life. It could just be, sometimes life stinks. That's a theme. I put some words here that are common in literature, related to common themes, in literature. So the idea of growing up. There are many themes in literature that involve this idea of growing up. Growing up itself is not a theme. It has to be something about growing up. So if we said growing up is a difficult process, then I've made a statement about growing up. I haven't just said growing up's the theme. It has to be a message about one of these big important topics in life. Okay, so we finally reached the end of the video. Thank you for hanging in there with me. These are very important words. They will be on your tests, your quizzes over our stories. They will be on your short story exam later in the semester. So it's really important that you know these. I have created a Quizlet that I'll post as well that has these definitions in them. But expect to have questions based on my commentary as well. Take care.